The Mandalorian Season 3. And Goo, this was a long time coming. I believe Season 2 came out in the winter or fall of 2020. So it's been almost 2.5 years since we've gotten Mandalorian content. Although that said, we did get the Book of Boba Fett and 2 Mandalorian episodes in there. But we've been waiting a while for this, which I think ultimately, when we get into this a little more, doesn't help things because they had a really long time, a really long runway here to deliver on the promise at the end of Season 2. And boy, do they do none of that. They don't do any of it.
And it seems like they just skipped the 2 years that we also were not with them.
Yeah, that was, you brought that up a couple of months ago, right before The Mandalorian started, as it was starting. Favreau had gone out of his way to say that there's a 2-year time jump here that they just don't acknowledge in the show, which is bizarre. Goo, let me get the nuts and bolts out of the way. And by the way, we'll go spoiler free for a few minutes here, but it's going to be tough to review this season without getting into spoilers. Goo, The Mandalorian is a rated TV 14 action, adventure, and fantasy. At some point in the last 2.5 years, they lost their sci-fi designation on IMDb. I'm not sure why, because there's actually a good deal of sci-fi, especially compared to Season 1. Goo, this season has a runtime of about 5 hours cumulatively. That's about 38 minutes an episode. Season 1 was about 4 hours and 17 minutes. Season 2 about 4 hours and 48 minutes. So slowly ramping up a little bit minutes wise.
Spending more time Mandalorian around.
Yeah, that's for sure. It feels like at 5 hours, you would have thought we would have had a ton of impactful time in this season, and it's almost devoid of it. On Rotten Tomatoes, Goo, this has a 90% from critics, 78% from the audience. And if you'd like to compare that to the first 2 seasons, Season 1 was 94%, 93%, universally liked.
Yeah.
Season 2 was 96%, 85%, so a little bit of a drop from the audience here, and then yet another drop again here from the audience. Also a little bit of a drop from the critics here. It seems like, at least the way I'm thinking, and so this is lining up with my thoughts, that people are just a little underwhelmed by what we saw.
I agree completely. There were big tentpole moments in the first 2 seasons where you might have had, I'm not even going to say lower lows, because episode 3 of this season is maybe the lowest that we had in all of The Mandalorian. But you definitely had dips, but bigger highs, dips and bigger highs through the first 2 seasons. But this one, it's a stretched out story that they try and tell throughout the entire season, but the story isn't necessarily interesting.
Yes, that's for damn sure.
So I do want to give them credit for trying. It just is kind of boring.
Yeah, very. On Metacritic, it was 70. Season 1 at a 69. Season 2 at a 76. So at least to me, Season 2 is still clearly head and shoulders above the other 2 seasons. I think you might have actually liked Season... Oh, no, you like Season 2 the most, too. Because
I like Season 1, then 2, then 3. Sorry to tip my hand, but I just did.
2-1-3, right?
2-1-3.
Yeah.
2-1-3. And I will say that the Metacritic here is more interesting than the Rotten Tomatoes, because Rotten Tomatoes, binary, thumbs up, I like it. I can see people just saying, I like it. It's not rotten. It doesn't stink. But for people to actually score this as something higher than Season 1, that's kind of confounding.
It's a little confusing. However, it is a well-made show, and the critics really do take that into account.
This also is the best-looking Star Wars stuff.
Yeah, and I don't take issue with any of that. Goo, of course, the show was created by Jon Favreau. He was the creator of the first 2 seasons as well, and of course, our great overseer Dave Filoni has a hand in everything Star Wars these days. Even more so now after the announcements of the last couple of weeks. The directors of this season, Goo. Rick Famuyiwa, who did episodes 1, 7, and 8. Bryce Dallas Howard did episode 6. That was the Lizzo episode. Carl Weathers did episode 4, where we got the Order 66 flashback. And then we got 3 newcomers to The Mandalorian here. Lee Isaac Chung did the real stinky episode 3. Rachel Morrison did episode 2. And Peter Ramsey did episode 5. With all the issues I have in this show, direction is not one.
May I ask, now everyone keeps on saying for the MCU, I know, different universe, to stop mentioning the blip, stop mentioning the snap, and let's move on. I'm going to ask Star Wars to stop with Order 66. We've seen enough.
Yes and no. We needed it for Grogu. We needed that context for Grogu.
That episode wasn't that good, though.
I agree with you, but we definitely needed to know where Grogu was.
Justice for Jar Jar.
Goose synopsis, and I think the synopsis might finally be true going forward, I should say. The travels of a lone bounty hunter in the outer reaches of the galaxy, far from the authority of the New Republic. Now, I don't think that synopsis was accurate to season 1, season 2, or season 3. However, where we're at the end of season 4, that may be true. That may be true, for better or worse.
Yeah.
This show stars Pedro Pascal as Din Djarin, a.k.a. the Mandalorian. Katee Sackhoff as Bo-Katan Kryze, who really was either the co-star or the star of this season.
She was the Mandalorian of this Mandalorian story.
Yeah, people were calling this season the Book of Bo-Katan, which is more or less accurate. Carl Weathers was back as Grief Karga, who plays a minor role, but he does pop up in several episodes. We've got Emily Swallow as the Armorer, Tate Fletcher as Paz Vizsla, Katie M. O'Brien as Elia Kane, Omid Abtahi as Dr. Pershing, and Giancarlo Esposito as Moff Gideon. I don't feel like running through all the other cameos and whatnot because they're all mostly meaningless. Most of the season is meaningless. Goo, I'll let you get your zingers out the way here before I get into it.
How dare you introduce my well thought out content like that? But yes, pardon my zinger. Hey, Mac, Mandalorian lore is all throughout the storyline of this season from pretty much the end of episode 1 through the end, and more like Mandaborian bore.
Got me with the double B's.
It's a real mid-DeLorean.
double laugh. Goo,
yes.
I do. This is, and I re-listened to our season 2 review. More or less, this is the direction we wanted them to go. Get into more Mandalorian stuff and less Grogu stuff. However, the way they went about it was not at all the way I would have predicted or wanted. And they also panicked. So at the end of season 2, they take Grogu out of the equation, which we actually loved. We loved that.
But we said leave him out of the equation for a season.
Yep. We talked about sort of Grogu fatigue.
Because they essentially did that this year where they just didn't have him involved anyways. So why not just not have him in the season? Like they said, we skipped 2 years. And this is also Grogu hung out with Luke Skywalker for a while. Right. Yet that character, there is no progression there.
Yeah, and that's the thing. They had made the right decision at the end of season 2, and I think that's why season 2 stands out above the other 2 seasons, because it's much more satisfying and it makes much more sense. And then they panic because Grogu is what's selling merchandise. Goo, as much as we like Mando, Grogu
fricks on him.
Grogu is the one driving sales behind merch for this show, and so they panicked. I don't know if it was Kathleen Kennedy. I don't know if it was Disney, but they forced Grogu back into the show when he did not need to be here. I am much more interested to see Grogu's growth under Luke Skywalker for a longer period of time. And I get why you do need to bring him back in at some point. He is vital to Din and Din's growth. But the way they do it in 2 episodes of the Book of Boba Fett, and then we're just back to square one, is really annoying.
So very simple. Start the season, 2-3 episodes. If you need to have him here, 2-3 episodes, no Grogu. Episode 4, you pretty much have those episodes from the Book of Boba Fett, squeeze them in here, and then you have Grogu for the next 3 episodes.
Yeah, it's real unfortunate, and that'll be a common theme here. We'll keep going back to the 2 Boba Fett episodes, which are better than anything in this season. Goo, this show was supposed to be the tentpole show for the Star Wars live-action universe, or at least that's what we were led to believe for the last few years, since its inception, really. And what has happened is Filoni has turned it into just another show. And we thought that at the end of season 2, we were going to be done with that. And we thought we were getting into the really good stuff. We thought, The boring stuff, the one-offs were over. We thought the show was going to go nuclear, and instead it went the opposite. And Filoni has this habit, and I've talked about it before, but he has this habit of wanting to connect everything and having a connective tissue amongst his universe. And that's what this show has turned into. Instead of standing on its own and being good on its own merit, the reason we have to watch this show, at least for this season, is what it's going to mean in Ahsoka and other properties going forward.
This show is now a jumping off point for other shows, for other characters. And, by the end of the season, it's essentially a reset. This season means nothing.
Meaningless. Meaningless is a good word for it. It's just, they hadn't done anything like this in live action until season 1 of The Mandalorian.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we bought into this promise or this potential for the show. And through 3 seasons now, it just has not hit that potential. It hasn't become what we had expected or hoped it to. So I think we got to let go of that now, especially, I don't even know if there's a need for a season 4. And this show has the exact same issues as every other Filoni-led project. There's too many one-offs. There's too many moments. Episode 3 is the perfect example, where we spend so much time on the littlest thing that ultimately does not affect the overall story. Filoni just loves that. And I get Filoni loves every little ounce, every little midichlorian in this Star Wars universe, but we don't.
Bring him back.
You and I are pretty big Star Wars fans, pretty big movie fans.
It's waning, but yes, go ahead.
Well, were anyways.
Yeah.
And we do not care about the stuff that Filoni cares about. The common fan doesn't care about that. We don't care about the droids and all that shit, but he does. And he forces all that stuff into the shows, and he doesn't just include them. He'll make a whole episode about this sort of stuff. And
I kind of like that episode, though.
Episode
the droid
3?
episode?
Oh,
no, the droid episode.
He just can't help it. And in a 24, 26 episode Clone Wars season, there's more space for that. In an 8 episode live action series that is supposed to be the tentpole of the Star Wars universe now, there's no room for it. There's no room to fuck around with that stuff, and it gets really annoying. And my Filoni criticisms, let's go back to season 1. My criticism of not necessarily Filoni, but let's say of The Mandalorian. I think season 1 had a serious pacing problem. It had 3 terrible episodes, and the episodes were very formulaic. 90% dialogue through most of the episode. All the fun was had at the end. It felt a lot like The Walking Dead in terms of the formula, not the content. It did look like Star Wars, but it didn't really feel like Star Wars, season 1. It had that more Western feel than it did sci-fi. And I know some people loved that. I didn't personally.
Yes, I did.
And then at the end of season 1, what I am most intrigued by, what I'm looking forward to, is Grogu's history and where Grogu goes going forward and all the Darksaber stuff. And that was enough for me to buy into the show. I thought the show had oodles of
You
potential.
also had a great sacrifice and scene with IG-11.
Right.
Which now is out the door.
Good. My season 2 criticisms. It was really hard to tell you what the plot of season 2 was. It was all over the map. Some really great stuff, some really high highs, also some low lows. The pacing issues persist, as well as those throwaway episodes. We also don't get like any new Grogu background or any new Darksaber.
Oh, we got his name.
Well, yeah, we do get his name via Luke. That's true. But that's at the very end of the season.
No, that's in the middle of the season.
In the middle? Yeah, you're right.
That's in the Ahsoka Tano show.
Yeah, you're right. And we also don't get like any Darksaber stuff in season 2, which was frustrating.
Well, he gets the Darksaber.
I know, but we
don't
get
the Darksaber stuff more in the Book of Boba Fett.
Yes, but we don't get it here, which is what the 2 things that I really wanted from season 1, or at the end of season 1, we don't really get. However, that's kind of thrown aside because the conclusion of season 2 is so awesome, and everything with Luke and Jedi is just really.
You know what I don't care about? Say what?
What?
The Darksaber.
Well, you haven't watched the Clone Wars. You haven't watched Rebels.
Okay, yeah, that's fine. But you know what looks really stupid on screen? Say what?
Dude, what looks really stupid on screen?
The Darksaber.
Oh, I don't agree. I think it looks awesome.
I think it looks terrible.
And it's the most unique lightsaber in the galaxy. You know,
you know what I saw as a criticism of this show, and I do buy into this, and I do think this actually was an issue. is that because so many of the characters this season were Mandalorian and they all had helmets on, it was really tough to convey any type of emotion or human connection with the characters.
That's definitely that's a good criticism, actually. I
Which
hadn't
then
really
made
thought
me
about
think
that.
back to, we always say to like the superhero movies, leave your masks on.
Yeah.
Maybe this is why they don't.
That is part of it. And that's what leads to the conclusion of season 2 being so great. And when Din removes his helmet, because you can see the raw emotion there. And I think that's what makes Bo-Katan such an awesome character too, is she's the one character who's,
and because she sits like this.
Yeah. And she's working with some real cake in the back there. But good, at the end of season 2, what I was really intrigued by, still Grogu stuff, still Darksaber stuff, but also I'm super intrigued by a galaxy that has Luke and Ahsoka Tano in play, right? I'm super curious what happens with Grogu training under Luke, which we then get answered in Boba Fett. And we don't end up getting enough of it because it's squeezed into Boba Fett. And then I'm curious because season 2 comes out right around the time that The Rise of Skywalker comes out. We learn that Palpatine comes back. So now we're curious, is Grogu's
cloning, everything else with that
tied into Palpatine?
Healing powers, they can heal people.
Right. So this season, I guess, says no, he's not tied into Palpatine, but it still remains to be seen. But coming into season 3, Goo, because we have all this unanswered stuff that is introduced in the first 2 seasons, I'm expecting a lot of it to get tied up. To get addressed.
Dragons and pirates.
And they don't really address any of it at all. We do get Order 66 and where Grogu was at that time. We don't get anything with the Darksaber other than, I won't spoil it yet, other than, the thing that happens to it in the conclusion. We just get it changing hands. Like, it's just really underwhelming. And it almost feels like the type of show that had a great premise and had a good idea out the gate, but they never wrote the rest of the show. And I wonder if that's why there was a 2.5 year gap, and why this almost feels like an incomplete season of television, because not a lot happens, Gil.
I might be in the minority here, but I like space pirates. I like them. I don't care. It's swashbuckling. It's fun.
So ultimately, my criticisms of this season are much of the same of the first 2. There's a lot of those same problems, and we get even worse storytelling in this season. We're waiting for some sort of conflict all season long. You think it's going to be maybe between Din and Bo, maybe between Din and the Armorer, Bo and the Armorer, Bo and whoever.
No, it's resolution.
And we get no, we need conflict.
No, I'm saying we get more resolution than conflict is what I'm saying.
And the season is focused on these characters for 6.5 episodes, 7.5 episodes. And then we knew he was coming back. It was the worst kept secret in the galaxy that Gideon was still alive. And then they just drop him back in at the end of the season.
And that's Gideon. Yes, that's Gideon.
They just drop him back in because they have no one for our characters to have conflict
since you just mentioned Gideon, let's just go ahead and say this. I hate the fact that we essentially get a mirror villain by the end of this season. What are we doing?
He does look great. And I have a
Well, they say people like Darth Vader, right? People like Black.
I do have quite a spiel on Gideon when we get there, but yeah, the luster has definitely worn off Gideon, and it's you start questioning everything about him because they never actually build up Gideon. He just keeps dropping in at the end of seasons, and you're like, at some point they're going to make him more complex, right? No,
and Gideon. While Mac is blowing his nose right now, I was filling it with song. Let's get into the Octagon. First one up here, Mac, is Fun Factor, and there was a serious lack of fun this season.
I have a hard time describing the events of this season as fun outside of episodes 7 and 8. There was a good amount of fun in 7 and 8. To what end, I don't really know, but there was fun in 7 and 8. The rest of the season, not so much.
Satisfactor, were we satisfied by the season? I didn't hate it. I was kind of satisfied by the end, and I was really satisfied by the end because we got a reset.
Yeah, that's true. That's a good point. I said 0, none.
Wow.
In fact, the season is incredibly unsatisfying because they don't tie anything up and don't explore anything. Nothing gets paid off. However, I did like the Zeb cameo, so that was mildly satisfying.
Borometer. Were you bored with this series? And yes, a good amount. There were several times where I stopped watching to the point that I had to binge it at the end.
Episodes 1, 3, 4, 5, 6 have a great deal of bore. Episode 3 is 45 minutes of bore. Episode 3 stands on its own, separate from this series, and looks even worse now with the knowing what happens at the end of the season.
Halloween. Will our interest in this season wane over time? Yes.
Yeah, I think so. And I think the whole series gets bumped down because of the lack of what transpires in this season.
Aquator. Is it better than 2017's Aquaman? And yes?
It's a toss-up for me. It's in that same
Wow.
zone. It's in that same zone.
Wow.
The show is well made. I care about almost nothing that happens in this season. So it's really hard to weigh that and compare it to Aquaman, but it is in that realm. It's in that range.
Pants Tent City. Excite Bike Mania. What got you going in this show?
So they set the season up. Actually, 3 seasons worth of episodes set up for this finale, these episodes 7 and 8, chapters 23 and 24. And the pants scent just never comes, Goo. And so neither did I. 3 seasons of storyline fall flat on its face.
You are a poet. You're a regular Dick Flavin.
I just feel like as a singular episode 8, chapter 24 is decent. As a finale to a 3 season long story arc, it's bad. It's not good. Accomplishes absolutely nothing. But again, Gideon does look cool.
Max Credit Union. Who are you giving credit to?
Katee Sackhoff is Bo-Katan Kryze. She's awesome. She's great. So to your credit, that might be because she's the only one that shows her face.
And that never really dawned on me. And then I'm like, that's a really good point.
Yeah. And she also will be I think she'll mean more going forward than Din Djarin will. Din Djarin's going to be off doing his own thing. I think Katee Sackhoff will be more prominent in stories we care about.
Max Credit Union. Who you giving it to?
We just did that.
No.
Yeah.
We did Pants Tent.
No, I just gave Katee Sackhoff credit.
Well, Mac, why don't you go ahead and shut up? For those of you tardy to the Mac and Goo party, we rate everything on a 40 hot dog rating system. And Mac, I did get to watch this on a binge, not because I chose to, but because I, after episode 3, needed some time off, which I do think helped with the pacing of the show and maybe my liking of the show. And I didn't hate any episode outside of episode 3. Granted, episode 6 was very distracting with its cameos and its characters. But I do appreciate them trying to give us a deeper, more in-depth look into the lore of these characters and tell it over an entire season. The only issue, it was kind of a boring story.
Right. Yeah. Again, that kind of leads to what I was saying is they start down that path, but they don't really know where it's going to lead. They didn't have anything written at the end of this. They just dropped Gideon back in.
It nowhere near has the highs of season 2 or even season 1. I still hate that Grogu is just back here. We wasted 2 episodes of the Book of Boba Fett doing that. They should have either had him come back at the end of this season. You could have done it in the middle of this season, but I just really don't like that. And the fact that they just skipped 2 years where nothing pretty much happened since the final time that we saw him in the Book of Boba Fett. That's also dumb. And the season's essentially a reset. So do you have to watch it? I guess that's up to you. And the main purpose is just to set up other stuff. I am 29 hot dogs.
Okay. That feels high to me. And to your point, I think if someone asked if they needed to watch the season, I would say no. You're not missing anything.
Yeah.
There's nothing in here. For some context, Goo, season 1, you gave it 33. I gave it 26-27, which I retconned to 24-25 after reviewing season 2. Season 2, you gave it 36-37. I gave it 33-34 in that range, which again, both clearly ahead of season 1.
A season so nice, I reviewed it twice.
So you're at 29 for season 3. That feels high.
Like
Dude,
I said, I think the binge helped. I'm not going to lie. I think binging really helped.
I agree with you in general with every show that helps because there's no downtime.
But
And
the mouse doesn't want us to do that.
My first point here, week to week, this show became an absolute task to watch.
Yes.
It just had nothing to pull you back. And especially after episode 3, there was some real soul searching I underwent because I was like, realistically, I have pulled the ripcord for much less than what season 3 or episode 3 did. I knew we were going to have to talk about this, so it kind of fucking roped me back in. It just took me forever to get back to episode 4. But seriously, was there anything satisfying in this season? Think back to how amazing the conclusion of season 2 was, or even when Gideon and the Darksaber get introduced in season 1 and IG-11's sacrifice. Those are all awesome things. This season doesn't have anything like that, nothing close to it. Moreover, we talked about this Grogu fatigue at the end of season 2 and moving on from Grogu into more Mandalorian stuff. And we sort of go that route. At least we started down that path with the Mandalorian stuff, but there was no real meat on that bone, which we were expecting or had hoped for. And then Grogu's just putzing around beside him the whole season.
That's the worst part about it, is that he's there, but he hasn't grown at all.
Right. And I get he's there because he rounds out Din Djarin as a character. Like that's his real use at this point. And they obviously felt similar to us in that because they remove him from the equation at the end of season 2. But again, they got to bring him back because he's too popular. And that's where I wonder if that would have happened if they were separate from Disney, right? I don't think we ever get this show without Disney, but I wonder without Disney as the lead, as the owner of the show, I wonder if they don't bring him back.
I feel like Lucas would have used it as an opportunity to introduce a new puppet.
Probably. Yeah, probably.
That's how you sell more toys. You create a new puppet.
But Grogu has really just become a spectacle now. Like he does nothing all season until the end when they need someone to use some force powers. And that's really fucking lazy.
And also, when
really
he's out there doing flips, all I say to myself is, I hate this.
There's no growth from him. All we get as far as history is the Order 66 flashback. So now where Grogu is at the end of season 1, the only thing we have now is his Luke's training and where he was at the end of Order 66.
And also, you could have had that Order 66 episode without having him with the Mandalorian during the season.
Yeah. Again, that's like those sandwich episodes.
You could have
like
had him just sitting on that rock, just thinking about it.
Yeah. And on top of all of this, the more I'm thinking about the season and the series as a whole, Moff Gideon never represents a real threat. He's just not a good villain. They beat him pretty quickly every time. So there's no redemption arc for our heroes. And not only does he not feel like a threat during this season's events, I have a hard time figuring out like exactly what his deal is.
You know what he should do is when Din and Grogu are right in front of him, he should stab a stormtrooper right in the neck with a box cutter.
That'd be better. Show no mercy. He's just not compelling in any way. He's not a complex villain. He wants to do all this like evil stuff, all this bad stuff just to be like what? 4th in the pecking order in the galaxy? Like this motherfucker's doing all this bad shit just to be Secretary of State. It doesn't make any sense. No, you want to be
on the if you're 3rd, you're at least on the pedestal there.
His motivations or lack thereof make no sense or they don't exist. And I get he's interested in the Mandalorians for the Beskar and the Beskar armor, but it persists for too long. Like what's his overall plan, Goo? He just wants to make 1 million clones and rehatch the Clone Wars. Like he was going to multiply himself times infinity,
they would all have the Force.
But I don't think they're all just going to listen to him.
I mean, I wouldn't listen to my master. I would claim that I was the real one.
Goose, Shrimping
I'm
Planet.
Gideon.
Shrimping Planet from season 1, Frog Lady from season 2. I felt like were the 2 worst episodes of the series by far. And now, Goo, we have a new nominee for worst episode of the series. It has now entered the pantheon of fucking horrific Mandalorian episodes. I'm calling it Amnesty Program. I don't know what else to call it. Episode 3, where they spend 45 minutes on Coruscant talking about these reformed imperialists, couldn't be less inspired, couldn't be less interesting. And ultimately, you think you sort of what you tell yourself is like, all right, this is going to be meaningful because it'll tie back into Gideon and eventually it'll all make sense. No, No, it doesn't. And so in this season, there's no mystery, there's no intrigue, and that leads to a lot of that bore and a lot of that disinterest. The only real question I had, and I think a lot of us had, is what the armorer's deal is. It seemed like they were hinting at she might not be that good of a person. Maybe she was the spy in that episode, Spies, but ultimately that doesn't happen. Nothing really happens with her. And everything else that happens outside of the armor, we expected all of that. There was no surprise in this finale or in this season. No grand reveal, no pants tent. The lows of the season may not have been as consistently low as the other two seasons. Obviously, episode 3 was really bad, but episode to episode, it might have had a little bit better of a pulse, but there is zero highs, Goo. So you don't get to blow your load like you had to in the other two seasons. There's just no...
You're making it really hard for me to use this for the radio.
There's just no real story other than the Mandalorians going back home. And that story maybe had three or four episodes worth of content.
Although I did like when they cued the music of "I'm coming home, I'm coming home."
Tell the world I'm coming home. It just feels like the season was ill-conceived, Goo. It's devoid of anything that would draw people in. And if this season had those 2 Boba Fett episodes, it would be a lot better.
I think it was a well-conceived season of like the long story being told. I just think the story is boring.
See, to me, that's ill-conceived.
That's a good point.
You write the story and then you're like, maybe we should scrap this. And this is the best thing they could come up with over 2.5 years. And again, we're left more thinking about those 2 Boba Fett episodes, which are way better than anything in this season. It might be the 2 best Mandalorian episodes of the whole series. But Goo, I have this at 24 day-old hot dogs for our now 24 seemingly pointless episodes. It's not bad. This show is not bad, but dealing with Star Wars expectations and things it could have done, it is a horribly disappointing season of television. And overall, this show is just very underwhelming.
Much like with the MCU, just lower expectations. Oh, hi, it's Goo from the Mac and Goo Movie Club. If you like what you just saw, you can find full episodes of our program on Apple Podcasts, TuneIn, Stitcher, CastBox, iHeartRadio, or wherever podcasts are found. And now it's time for girls jumping on trampolines.